So this chapter begins with a story featuring the experiences of a woman who worked for a radio station owned by a large chain. And frankly, this story presents these radio stations owned by large chains like Clear Channel and Cumulus in a pretty harsh light. These stations tend to rely very heavily on national syndicated material like programs featuring Ryan Seacrest or Rush Limbaugh. And there's very little local character to a lot of the shows. There's very little local ambiance or music that reflects the local community. So this story, I think, raises some broader questions for us about how these large chains like Clear Channel are operating radio stations and if they're really doing a good job serving the needs of people in local communities. It's really an open question, and it's an issue that we're going to continue to discuss. As radio emerged as a new technology and media, the US government had to grapple with how to best regulate and oversee radio. And I think what we do see is that in the early 1900s, 1910s, 20s, there were two main priorities that guided how the US government regulated radio. The first priority was one of protecting and promoting safety on ships and boats. Radio was a very effective means of protecting passengers and crews on ships. So the ability to send distress signals became really paramount, and the government wanted to make certain that a system was in place so that ships would be able to send distress signals and really try to avoid any kind of interference from other operators that would impede those kind of distress signals. The second major priority that guided the US government was nationalism. Essentially, the government wanted to make certain that radio internationally was firmly controlled by American interests. The US government was uneasy with European and British companies being so involved in the development of radio, especially given the uneasy wartime atmosphere internationally. So essentially, the U.S. government wanted to make certain that companies like RCA were in a dominant position, and that these foreign entities did not have any major control or stake over this new technology that might have national security implications. the antitrust action by the U.S. government and the Federal Trade Commission against RCA in the 1920s brings up another priority of the U.S. government in terms of how it regulated radio. The government became increasingly concerned about the monopolistic practices of RCA and its near total domination of radio at this time. All right, because you had this mega company, RCA, that had a dominant role in the production of radio receivers, while at the same time it had a near monopoly on programming through its network, NBC. So one of the priorities of the U.S. government over the years is to make certain that no one company has monopolistic control over a particular economic sector. And this concern about monopolies is especially important in the realm of the media because we rely on media to provide us with a broad range of ideas and to promote free expression, different points of view, and so on. Well, it's hard to ensure free expression and diversity and democracy when you've got one big company out there like RCA that has such a dominant position in media. So that was, I think, one reason why the Federal Trade Commission took action against RCA that ultimately resulted in it being broken up. The Radio Act of 1927 that was passed into law was an important piece of legislation for a few different reasons. Basically, the U.S. government decided it had to act to bring some order to the chaotic environment in which radio operated in the 1920s. Essentially what was happening was you had lots of individuals and companies that were just, opening their own radio stations, broadcasting at will, at whatever time and whatever frequency they wanted. And what happened was that you had these signals that overlapped with each other and caused a lot of interference, so that most people increasingly could not hear radio signals clearly on their receivers because of all of this interference. So the U.S. government decided that it would have to act and kind of lay down the law in terms of setting out a manageable structure for radio. So it decided that it would have the authority to tell radio stations what frequency they could broadcast on, what could be the strength of their signal, and so on and so forth. Now, what's important about this 1927 Radio Act is the justification that the Act provided that gave the U.S. government the authority to set out these ground rules and essentially act as a traffic cop to tell radio stations when and where they could broadcast. Now, prior to this, radio stations and companies would say, hey, U.S. government, you can't tell us what to do. We are a private company and we own this radio station, all right? So you telling us what to do would be government intrusion and interference and a violation of our First Amendment free speech rights. Well, in this 27 Act, the U.S. government articulated a really important historical principle, which is the idea that radio stations did not own the electromagnetic spectrum that their radio signal was broadcast on, right? Instead, the stations said that the stations could only license their channels and use the channels to broadcast their radio signals as long as they operated in the, quote, public interest, convenience, and or necessity. Public interest, convenience, or necessity. This principle, the idea of operating in the public interest, became the historic justification for the U.S. government requiring radio stations and later television stations to act in certain ways that was considered to be in the public interest. Essentially, the argument here was that private individuals and companies did not own the airwaves or the electromagnetic spectrum, but rather those airwaves were a public resource that belonged to everybody, that belonged to society more generally. And because of this communal ownership, that provided the right for our representatives in government to make certain that these airwaves, this electromagnetic spectrum, was used in a way that would best serve our public interest. So it laid out that principle that the airwaves are a public resource, and as a result, the U.S. government can tell radio stations or TV stations what to do or how to operate in a way that is consistent with that public interest. The Radio Act of 1927 also created an important government agency, the Federal Radio Commission, or the FRC, that was responsible for regulating radio and implementing key provisions of this 27 Act. Later on, this agency was renamed the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, with the Communication Act of 1934, and that's the name that this agency still has today. And the FCC today still uses this justification of the public interest as the reasoning for and justification for its policies requiring radio or TV stations to do certain things.